Watch what happens when someone tries to use ethics to win a corporate boardroom battle. Notice how they present their case with passionate conviction about fairness, justice, and what is right. Observe the polite nods around the table. Then watch the decision get made based on entirely different criteria: revenue, market share, risk assessment, political convenience. This pattern repeats across every level of human organization. The idealistic employee argues for workplace fairness and gets labeled as naive. The activist presents moral imperatives to legislators who calculate voter demographics. The partner in a relationship demands ethical behavior from someone who operates purely on self-interest. The disconnect is not accidental. It reveals something fundamental about how human hierarchies actually function versus how we are taught they should function. Every institution claims to operate according to noble principles. Every organization publishes mission statements about integrity and values. Yet when critical decisions arise, these same institutions consistently prioritize survival, growth, and competitive advantage over moral consistency. Power does not care about your moral framework. It operates according to its own laws, laws that exist independently of what anyone believes is right or wrong. Understanding this disconnect is not cynical, it is strategic. Those who grasp how power actually functions gain influence. Those who insist it should function according to moral principles remain perpetually frustrated. The fundamental error lies in confusing how things should work with how they do work. Moral arguments assume that decision-makers share your ethical framework and will act according to it when presented with sufficient justification. This assumption fails consistently because it misunderstands the nature of power itself. Moral reasoning operates in the realm of the abstract. It deals with principles, ideals, and universal truths. Power operates in the realm of the concrete. It deals with resources, relationships, and immediate consequences. These are different languages describing different realities. When someone speaks moral language to power structures that only understand strategic language, translation failure is inevitable. The person making moral arguments often feels they are speaking obvious truths that any reasonable person should accept. They become frustrated when these truths are ignored or dismissed. They interpret resistance as evidence of moral failure in others rather than strategic inadequacy in their approach. This frustration compounds their ineffectiveness because it leads them to make the same arguments more loudly rather than different arguments more strategically. Power is not distributed based on moral merit. It accumulates according to leverage, positioning, and strategic value. The person who controls resources, information, or access does not surrender these advantages because someone presents a compelling ethical case. They surrender them when keeping them becomes more costly than giving them up. Consider the workplace hierarchy. When an employee argues that a promotion should be based on fairness rather than favoritism, they are making a moral argument. When they demonstrate their irreplaceable value to the organization, they are making a power argument. Which approach produces results more consistently? The moral argumenter appeals to abstract principles. The strategic operator provides concrete incentives and consequences. Decision-makers respond to what affects their position, not to what sounds philosophically correct. This is not a character flaw. It is how humans navigate complex social systems where multiple competing interests exist. Examine the dynamics more closely. The employee making the moral argument assumes that managers should want to be fair. They present evidence of their superior performance, their dedication, their ethical behavior. They expect these virtues to be rewarded because reward should follow merit. When the promotion goes to someone less qualified but more politically connected, they feel betrayed by a system that claims to value fairness. The employee making the strategic argument understands that managers want to protect their own positions. They align themselves with successful projects, cultivate relationships with influential people, and make themselves valuable to those who control advancement opportunities. They do not expect the system to be fair, they expect it to be predictable. When they understand the actual rules rather than the stated rules, they can navigate effectively. The difference is not moral versus immoral behavior. Both employees might share identical ethical values. The difference is realistic versus idealistic strategy. One approach acknowledges how promotion decisions are actually made. The other approach assumes promotion decisions should be made according to abstract principles of justice. The historical record reveals this pattern consistently. Social changes that appear to be driven by moral awakening actually result from shifts in power dynamics. The abolition of slavery was not simply the result of moral arguments, though these existed for centuries before abolition occurred. It happened when slavery became economically disadvantageous and politically untenable for those who could end it. Women's suffrage was not granted because society suddenly recognized the moral imperative of equal representation. It occurred when women gained economic influence, when political leaders needed their support, and when maintaining the status quo became more costly than changing it. The moral arguments provided the justification, but power calculations drove the decisions. This does not diminish the importance of moral progress. It clarifies how such progress actually occurs. Those who want to create change must understand that moral correctness alone is insufficient. They must alter the power equation in ways that make their desired outcome advantageous for decision-makers. The civil rights movement demonstrates this principle clearly. While moral arguments about equality had existed for decades, meaningful change occurred when several power dynamics shifted simultaneously. Economic boycotts threatened business interests. International embarrassment damaged America's global position during the Cold War. Demographic changes made African American votes politically crucial in swing states. Television coverage made violent suppression politically expensive for segregationists. These practical pressures created opportunities for moral arguments to become effective. The moral framework provided the language for change, but the power shifts created the motivation for those who could implement change. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. understood both dimensions and used them strategically rather than relying on moral persuasion alone. The environmental movement illustrates this principle clearly. For decades, activists made moral arguments about humanity's responsibility to preserve nature. These arguments were intellectually compelling but politically ineffective. Environmental policy began changing rapidly only when climate change was reframed as an economic threat, a national security issue, and a competitive disadvantage. When environmental protection became profitable rather than costly. When green energy became cheaper than fossil fuels. When environmental disasters began affecting powerful constituencies, the moral arguments suddenly found receptive audiences. The ethics had not changed, but the economics had. Power holders could afford to embrace environmental morality when doing so served their strategic interests. The same pattern appears in personal relationships. Someone who repeatedly argues that their partner should treat them better because it is the right thing to do often finds themselves ignored. Someone who demonstrates that disrespectful treatment will result in consequences that the partner wants to avoid tends to see behavior change more quickly. This is not about abandoning moral principles. It is about understanding that moral principles alone do not motivate those who do not share them. Power responds to power, not to ideology. Those who possess power respond to factors that affect their power, not to abstract arguments about what is correct. Consider the common relationship dynamic where one partner repeatedly explains why certain behaviors are hurtful or disrespectful. They provide detailed analyses of how these behaviors violate relationship norms, damage trust, and create emotional distance. They appeal to shared values about love, commitment, and mutual respect. Yet the behaviors continue. The partner making these moral arguments assumes that their counterpart wants to be a good partner and will modify behavior when shown how it falls short of moral standards. But this assumption often fails because it misunderstands the other person's actual motivations. The disrespectful behavior might serve purposes that the moral arguments do not address: control, attention-seeking, avoidance of responsibility, or simple habit reinforced by lack of consequences. When someone instead demonstrates through actions that disrespectful treatment will result in emotional withdrawal, reduced cooperation, or other consequences that the partner values avoiding, behavior often changes more rapidly. The moral framework remains important, but it becomes effective only when supported by practical incentives that align with the other person's actual motivations. The error becomes compounded when moral argumenters mistake others' polite agreement for genuine commitment to change. Decision-makers often nod along with ethical presentations because disagreeing publicly carries social costs. But nodding does not indicate intention to act. It indicates recognition that moral opposition is politically expensive. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. The person making moral arguments interprets polite reception as evidence that their approach is working. They continue using moral reasoning while wondering why nothing changes despite apparent agreement. They begin to question others' integrity rather than examining their own strategic approach. The most effective operators understand this dynamic and use it strategically. They do not abandon moral considerations, but they do not rely on them as primary tools of influence. They frame their moral positions in terms of practical advantages for those who have the power to implement them. Consider how successful civil rights leaders operated. While they articulated powerful moral visions, they also demonstrated the economic costs of discrimination, the international embarrassment of racial inequality, and the political risks of maintaining oppressive systems. They made moral arguments irresistible by making them advantageous. The language of power is different from the language of morality. Power speaks in terms of costs and benefits, risks and opportunities, competitive advantages and threats. Moral arguments translated into this language become more persuasive, not because decision-makers suddenly develop ethical consciences, but because they can see how moral actions serve their interests. This translation process requires understanding what motivates the specific power holders you need to influence. A corporate executive responds to different incentives than a politician, who responds to different incentives than a family member. The underlying moral principle may remain constant, but the presentation must adapt to the audience's power structure. The most sophisticated approach involves creating situations where moral behavior becomes the path of least resistance. This means designing incentives, consequences, and social pressures that make ethical choices the easiest and most advantageous options for decision-makers. The moral outcome is achieved through strategic means rather than moral persuasion. Power holders often prefer moral justifications for their decisions because these justifications help maintain their legitimacy. They want to appear ethical, but they will not sacrifice their positions for ethical purity. Understanding this preference allows strategic operators to help power holders find moral frameworks that support mutually beneficial outcomes. The timing of moral arguments matters critically. When someone's power position is secure, they can afford to ignore ethical appeals. When their position becomes vulnerable, they become much more receptive to arrangements that provide both moral justification and practical advantage. Effective influence requires recognizing these windows of opportunity. The legal system demonstrates this principle clearly. Laws change not because society suddenly recognizes moral truths, but because political forces make certain legal positions untenable. Supreme Court decisions that appear to be moral breakthroughs typically reflect broader shifts in social power that make the old positions unsustainable for the institutions involved. Corporate social responsibility provides another example. Companies adopt ethical policies not because executives experience moral conversions, but because consumer pressure, regulatory threats, and competitive dynamics make ethical positioning profitable. The moral outcomes are real, but the driving forces are strategic rather than idealistic. This understanding liberates those who want to create positive change from the frustration of relying solely on moral persuasion. Instead of wondering why people do not care about what is right, they can focus on making what is right align with what is advantageous for those who control relevant decisions. The process requires patience because power structures change slowly, but it also offers hope because power structures do change when the incentives that maintain them shift. Those who understand both moral principles and power dynamics can work systematically to create these shifts rather than hoping for spontaneous ethical enlightenment. The most enduring changes occur when moral principles become embedded in power structures themselves. This happens when ethical behavior becomes institutionally rewarded and unethical behavior becomes institutionally costly. Creating these institutional changes requires understanding how institutions actually function rather than how they claim to function. Consider how workplace harassment policies evolved. Early efforts focused primarily on moral arguments about dignity and respect. These arguments were correct but largely ineffective until sexual harassment became a legal liability that could result in massive financial penalties for organizations. When companies faced expensive lawsuits, damaged reputations, and regulatory sanctions, anti-harassment policies became standard practice. The moral arguments provided the framework for understanding why harassment was wrong, but legal and financial consequences provided the motivation for institutional change. Both elements were necessary, but the power dynamics drove the transformation while the moral arguments legitimized it. The technology sector offers contemporary examples of this pattern. Privacy protection, data security, and algorithmic fairness are increasingly embraced by tech companies, not because engineers and executives suddenly developed stronger ethical consciences, but because regulatory pressure, competitive differentiation, and user demands made these practices strategically advantageous. When ethical behavior becomes profitable and competitively advantageous, it gets adopted widely. When it remains costly, it gets practiced primarily by those whose moral commitments outweigh their strategic interests, a much smaller group with limited influence. Personal relationships offer the clearest laboratory for testing these principles. Notice the difference between complaining about someone's behavior and changing the dynamics that reward that behavior. Notice how quickly people adapt when their environment makes considerate behavior advantageous and inconsiderate behavior costly. The goal is not to become cynical about human nature, but to become realistic about human motivation. Most people want to be good, but they want to survive and prosper more than they want to be good. Understanding this hierarchy allows moral advocates to work with human nature rather than against it. The most successful operators develop the ability to think like power holders while maintaining their own moral compass. This dual perspective allows them to identify opportunities where moral positions can be presented as strategic advantages. They become translators between the world of ethics and the world of influence. This approach requires abandoning the fantasy that decision-makers should be motivated primarily by moral considerations. It embraces the reality that decision-makers are motivated primarily by factors that affect their positions. Once this reality is accepted, moral advocates can begin designing strategies that work within actual human psychology rather than idealized versions of it. The translation process involves understanding the specific interests, pressures, and constraints facing the decision-makers you need to influence. Then identifying ways that moral outcomes can serve these interests or relieve these pressures. Finally, presenting moral positions in language that resonates with the decision-maker's existing priorities and concerns. This is not manipulation. It is communication. The moral goals remain genuine. The strategic presentation makes them achievable rather than merely aspirational. The difference between effective and ineffective moral advocacy often lies in this translation capability rather than in the strength or correctness of the underlying ethical positions. The ultimate irony is that those who understand power dynamics often achieve more moral outcomes than those who rely purely on moral arguments. By working with the grain of how influence actually operates, they can create systems where ethical behavior becomes the natural and rewarded choice.